Today's topic is scientific temper, cyber tech in the digital century. And joining me we have two panelists over here. We have Arun Sukumar. He, as you know, is the author of Midnight Machines. It's a political history of technology in India. So I'm going to be very interested in how he combines technology with politics. In fact, he talks about how our governing class has come to see technology first and foremost as an instrument of politics. And it's a very interesting subject. In fact, I don't know if you'll begin by telling us a bit about your book while we are waiting for our next panelist, Mr. Ambassador Feakin, about how you see, you've seen the role or rise of technology and how at various times it's been curbed because of politics or encouraged because of a political motive. So this intersection of politics and technology is something that I personally found interesting, being a political journalist also.
I will miss no opportunity to plug the book. But it is, as Priya said, a book that looks at how political interventions have shaped the way in which Indians have generally absorbed or not absorbed technology. And the book is sort of trying to make a dent in this literature, which has thus far been dominated by hagiographies of India's atomic and space programs, and look at more civilian-facing technologies that, including the Green Revolution and, after 2000, some of the stuff that has been happening in the digital space, which I hope we'll get a chance to talk about. And the broad theme of the book is that we may think technology has a life of its own and that it has revolutionized. Of course, it has since the last 2 decades especially. It has really turned India's economy around in a big way. But most of those decisions, whether to introduce or reject technologies, usually come down to political decisions that are unfortunately not analyzed in as much detail as they should. So that's sort of a sneak peek to that book.
While I bring in our second panelist, Ambassador Tobias Feakin. He is Australia's first ambassador for cyber affairs, and his main focus, I think, is to lead engagements and protect Australian interests in the field of politics, trade, foreign policy, economics in the world of internet and cyberspace. Welcome, Ambassador Feakin. Hi. And before we begin, a bit about yourself, if you can, I've been reading a bit about you, but your interest here, and especially, at a point like this, your interest in the Indo-Pacific region. I know you're a little concerned about the build-up of offensive cyber capabilities, but that we'll talk about later. But just a bit about what you do.
Yeah, the life of a cyber diplomat. We're a relatively new breed, I'd say, and if you want a bit of a history of cyber diplomacy, I guess in many ways we have the Russians to thank for these kinds of positions, ironically enough. If we think about some of the main protagonists in the international arena, there's one name that always seems to come up time and time again, be it election interference, not pettier malware, interference with routers, automated router scanning, and a whole range of other things that I could mention, which I can talk about now, which I couldn't when I started this job 3 years ago. But in 1998, a gentleman called Andrei Kritsky went to the UN on behalf of the Russian government and asked that there be a broader discussion around information security. And so, if you like, he kicked off the multilateral international discussion. And since then, there's probably somewhere between 30 to 40 of us who, if you like, have the ambassador status and some title along the lines of Ambassador for Cyber Affairs or Cyber Security or whatever it might be. But more broadly, in foreign affairs departments around the world, there's probably about 50 positions which are coordination positions within a foreign affairs ministry in order that a country can project itself out into the international environment and get a better grip on what it wants out of the digital environment. Should there be 190 plus countries who have these kinds of positions? Absolutely. There's often, depending on the mood that I'm in, when I start a bit of a conversation with a room, I often start with really irritating questions like, who knows what the internet is? And then I ask for a show of hands, and I'm sure everyone will say yes. Who checked their phone when they woke up this morning? Yes. Well, isn't it then pretty important that we understand that if there's such a vital piece of infrastructure that enables everything we do as human beings, both personally, professionally, in any other aspect of our lives, that we should be taking it pretty seriously in a foreign affairs context and in the way that we relate to one another as nations. But that hasn't been a simple message to share often. And getting that if you like, the leap between that logic and the logic of, oh yes, and we better do something about that, has been quite tough at times. But I think we're there now, and certainly I'm sure we'll get onto, and it's already been alluded to, now the centrality of not just cyberspace and, if you like, what's going on in that environment, but the broader technology environment, how center stage this issue is now, just coming from Rosina and pretty much any conference or discussion I'm in, it is center of geopolitics. So if you're not in the game, you're going to be out of the long-term game over the next 50 to 100 years if you're not in the middle of that tech discussion in the international environment.
In fact, before you walked in, we were talking about technology and politics and how, politicians and technology can be used both ways. So, Arun, we are here at a point where, we are seeing we have a government that came to power on the power of technology. But now I think it finds itself very ironically caught also in the technology trap, where it cannot control the beast it has unleashed, so to speak. So a bit in the, not just the domestic content and the international content, or how do we, he spoke a bit about it, technology is something, but there's also this flip side of technology.
Whatever we say about Prime Minister Modi, I think the fact is that he has been, he of course dominates the narrative, the political, economic and social narrative in a way that few Indian Prime Ministers have been able to do, few Indian figures have been able to do. And technology was key to his rise to power, as you said. So in my book, for instance, I don't suggest that he has grown wary of technology, but if you notice, for example, in January 2019, and this clip sort of went viral, there is this, for the uninitiated in the room, there is this discussion between the mother of a school-going child who asked the Prime Minister in a discussion, as he does occasionally with exam students about to take exams, my son keeps at it with video games, and she wanted the Prime Minister's advice to get her son to wean away from this sort of video games called PUBG. And the Prime Minister said, the Prime Minister knew what the video game was, which is the clip that went viral. He said, "Ye PUBG wala hai kya?" which sort of, triggered lots of laughter in the room. And he then goes on to say, which I think reflects this sort of discussion that he's been having, at least internally with himself, about technology. He says, "Ye Samasya bhi hai, Samadhaan bhi hai," which means technology is both the problem and the solution. So I think that there is at least some soul searching that is happening within even the leadership of a government that came to power riding on the virtues of technology. It marshaled the power of technology in a way that few agencies or few institutions have been able to do globally to create some sort of a political movement, getting, people talk about India's demographic dividend, but here it is a political movement that was successfully able to harvest that movement and that dividend through the power of technology, and they do still. The ruling party, the Bharatiya Janata Party's control over the narrative, the political narrative, is largely on account of the fact that it has created this machine using channels such as WhatsApp. Now, the uses to which it may put this machine to is up for debate. But the fact is they've built this machine, which also means that the Indian government is conscious about things like fake news or disinformation campaigns. For example, during the 2019 election season, as it were, the 4 months of 2019, it was the BJP that petitioned the Election Commission of India suggesting that China was using its ownership, well, the Chinese company owns TikTok, ByteDance, its ownership of TikTok to spread fake news during the campaign, directed at, whatever, anti-India messages and so on and so forth. I found it fascinating that it was the ruling party that said, because it was essentially the BJP that created, it was the BJP's original sin that led to this system or machine being created. And it's essentially, to a social scientist, it's fascinating that here is an external actor that is making use of its ownership in this domain to create, to spread fake news, to use it for all sorts of quote-unquote malicious purposes, and the government is now sort of, probably waking up and realizing that the beast, as you said, that they've unleashed may, it may well be time to sort of roll it back in. I don't know whether it will happen at all, but I think that seems to be the sentiment now.
Before we go on to China and how countries that control that make cheap technology get to control the narrative, run with that thought. What he said, that technology is both the problem and the solution.
So I think there is a real danger that we get away from the fact that, the technologies, well, which technologies are we talking about? I mean, most of my time is spent talking about cyberspace and the technologies that underpin it, but increasingly the new and emerging technologies, if you like, which are going to be the emerging and future enabling technologies, whether they be 5G, AI,
Let's talk about China
computing.
also.
Yeah. So all of these technologies provide us with a fundamental opportunity that we should be grasping for our economic benefit, for our social enablement and development cycles. And that's where this conversation should be. But unfortunately, what we've seen is a certain selection. Certainly, I'm dealing a lot with different states. The misuse of these, the freedoms that those kinds of technological advancements allow us as societies. And you were talking about political enablement through the use of social media. Well, it wasn't long ago that we were heralding, if you like, the age of, Obama's campaign back in the late 2000s and how incredible it was that he used social media to such effect, and various other 2011 and the Arab Spring. But what has clearly happened in the interim is that authoritarian regimes have spotted that, been petrified by it, firstly, but then secondly understood, well, if we can harness the openness and freedoms that this allows and flip them on their head and weaponize it, well, then we can change this equation. And I think they do have us in a bit of a bind at the moment of feeling quite scared of that environment and scared of what it could mean. And I was asked a really interesting question this morning, which was, as governments, are you being too paranoid and overestimating the ability of influencing campaigns in the digital environment? Should you not, or are you underestimating an individual, a citizen's ability to be able to decipher what's good or bad? And I said, well, look, if I'm working in government, I can't afford to underestimate what a foreign influence campaign could do in the digital space, because if I do, even in the slightest margin, well, I could easily assist in losing the trust of the public. And it's very easy to lose that. How do you get that back? It takes a lot longer to get it back once you've lost it. So we are in this bind that essentially, this incredible environment called the internet was invented and has enabled such freedom of expression, development, innovation, economic growth, many wonderful positives, is now being flipped and used back against us, and does create a very different equation. So part of the job of diplomats like me and others within government, and to be frank, broader civil society, is to rebalance that equation, because it's not to sound too flippant in the responses, but genuinely, it's not that government can answer all these questions and expect that we will change this entire equation. This is a whole of society combination of responses that are required in order that we can rebalance what currently is going on.
So how exactly, a little bit more about what exactly you do, to balance the narrative, or do you reach out to governments? Is it informal situations like this?
Sure. I mean, so there's an answer that I could give you which would go on for 30 minutes on that front, so I'll try and make it far more succinct, exactly, the short version. So what do? Well, firstly, when I first got this job, I had a responsibility to provide some strategy around what it was that we do. And I think, if there's one thing, I came from think tanks into government, so it was a bit like, just playing, well, to my skills and strengths, really. I want to be able to write and strategize about something before I crack on and then deliver something. So that helps. And I think if any government needs to be not just responding instantly, but thinking seriously about, well, what is it that we want from this technological means? What are the kinds of things that we want then from society, from our bilateral relationships, our multilateral engagements? So that's what we did in 2017. We'll go back through that process from now through the next 6 to 12 months of re-strategizing in terms of what it is we want out of technology. So what do we do? Well, it means stating clearly, what is it you want economically out of this environment? What are the security risks you need to address to be able to achieve those positive outcomes? And then what are the things that we want to protect in that environment? How do you protect human rights? What kinds of engagements do you need to promote to be able to do that? How do we ensure that the internet doesn't become a state-controlled entity, as some states are trying to encourage? And then how do you utilize technology for positive development cycles? And one way we've done that is through investing heavily in capacity capacity building work around the Indo-Pacific in order that our partners and friends around the region can not only increase their cybersecurity, but take a lot more benefit from the online space. And we think through that positive engagement and, to be frank, a great deal of transparency around what it is we do as Australia in the international environment, then we can help create that far more positive environment that we think is beneficial to a far broader group than the, to be frank, rather worrying opposite.
China has been flagged off, even though Hawaii is much cheaper than the others, but they've been flagged off for government controlling data surveillance. So would you be worried? Do you think that's a good move, or do you think access is really what counts?
I think so. On that issue, Priya, I think Huawei has been able to sell telecommunications equipment cheaper compared to some of the other vendors. With regards to existing technology, there is actually no guarantee that the stuff that they will provide, the 5G enabled networks, will really be cheaper or more expensive compared to their counterparts. But essentially, I think, and the update on that is that the Indian government has permitted trials for all vendors, including Huawei, and perhaps they will take a decision based on how these trials go on the merits. But if these things, if history is any indication, they tend to be more political than determined by what the merits of the decision are. And I wouldn't say for a moment that the politics should not be part of the merits of the decision. But the fact is that...
A whole book on that.
Yeah, but, for example, the fact that we share such a long border with China, and we've traditionally had, at some points, adversarial, but at some other points, let's say, not so warm relations with China, is a factor for any country to consider while you absorb a company like Huawei into the telecommunications infrastructure of your country, which you already have, but perhaps the argument goes 5G would essentially make that integration of Chinese equipment, including all the attendant intelligence and surveillance prospects, with you bring it with Huawei, and perhaps they may be difficult. It may be difficult then to sort of extract China out of the system. That is the argument that is being sort of offered against Huawei. The thing here is, if the decision for India, this is not a decision that has to be made as with any, say Australia or Germany or any of the other countries that are weighing the decision on Huawei, because to begin with, we are not an advanced economy, so we are not in what you could call tertiary stages of digitalization like Australia or the United States or any of the European countries that are weighing Huawei. We have very different priorities. The standards for the applied uses of 5G are not going to be your mobile phones. They're going to be in traditional sectors, health, education, things that really matter to India. So it's... Of course, all of the security considerations have to be kept in mind, but at the end of the day, you have to figure out whether Huawei is keeping Huawei out when you anyway don't have any control over the standards that have been developed either by the Chinese vendors or by European or American vendors in this domain. It doesn't really matter, in my view. I don't mean to sound flippant, but the prospect of surveillance exists. You may want to flip a coin and decide whether you want to be surveilled by the Chinese or the Americans. But at the end of the day, there are far more important economic considerations that should ideally underpin the decision on Huawei. But I don't know. These things tend to take a life of its own. And like I said, politics may drive the decision eventually.
We come to that old argument over security versus your right to privacy, I think.
Can we stick on 5G for a moment? I didn't think I'd say that because usually I'd try and get through a conversation without 5G, but I think we need to now. And it's fascinating actually how the 5G conversation for me is one of many that we're now going to have over the coming years. It's, if you like, the tip of the technology iceberg, the canary in the coal mine, whatever it might be. But we're increasingly making big investments in these new technology areas. So the Australian case, which has been much spoken about, much reported in the media, and everyone, I think, has at least a bit of an understanding that we took a very early decision in August 2018 to ensure that high-risk vendors weren't allowed into our backbone infrastructure to build that backbone infrastructure. And why was it that we felt that high-risk vendors shouldn't be in that backbone infrastructure? Actually, the decision was one of risk mitigation, but it was equally a decision about confidence in your economic prosperity for the future as it was a security decision. Because let's be frank, if you don't feel that you have certainty in the consistent delivery of a 5G network, but regardless of the reasons for that, well then, you know, you're endangering your economy to function. You know, this is a piece of infrastructure that really does enable Internet of Things and everything that spins off the back of that. You know, and when you look at a 5G network in its mature state, and this is the decision that we made, and this is something that I think increasingly governments are going to have to be thinking about. It's not about the here and now. It's not about making a decision of, oh, well, we'll put a 5G network in, and basically the beginnings of a 5G network operates in exactly the same way as a 4G network does, which is you have a core, which is the core element of that network is where you put all your high-risk functions. And then you have a peripheral part of that network, which is where you have those kinds of functions which you're not so concerned about. And that's really simplistic terms. Once you get into a 5G, mature 5G network, there is no distinguishing between those things. And the easiest example to use is the driverless car, right, which is going to be enabled by a mature 5G network somewhere down the line. Now, you don't want that car dropping out, if you like, of its signal strength at any point during its journey. Would you get in that car if you had any lack of confidence in the network being able to produce a similar level signal and quality of interaction at any point? I doubt anyone in this room would want to get in that car. I certainly wouldn't. And so for us, the risk that we felt was inherent, that if we'd basically given the keys away to the network car, if you will, the 5G network, and we were unclear as to whether the high-risk vendor would enable another state, its state of origin, to have access to those keys and essentially switch it on and off if it chose to. Not saying that it would, but having that risk, we felt that was a risk that was too high to absorb and allow into our network. And there's a whole other range of reasons as to why we did that. But you know, it was making a decision about a piece of technology and what it looked like in 10 years' time, not here now. And that's an incredibly difficult thing for any leadership to do, because you're, especially in, you know, wonderful liberal democratic countries like ours, because you know, you're always thinking about the next ballot box and the next vote that takes place, but it takes incredible, I think, foresight to be able to make those decisions when you're looking way beyond your next party room scuffle, or you know, the next time that there's actually going to be some form of election. Difficult decisions for us all, but increasingly means that we as policymakers who are dealing with this, analysts from outside, are helping our senior leadership make those decisions in a really mature, educated fashion. And I think, you know, whilst for quite a while Australia was alone in that decision, you've seen a number of other countries begin to take similar decisions, not perhaps the same approach, but I think it's continuing, right? You know, there's still a whole range of other countries that are still thinking and considering what they're going to do around 5G. But you wait, this will keep happening. You know, we will see big decisions come around quantum computing, around AI, and I guarantee you'll keep seeing this this train moving along of big technology decisions.
So you're just the ambassador for cyber affairs, but he also helps politicians think in what? A mature and educated fashion. That's a tough call. But do you want to rebut on his 5G?
Not so much to rebut, but to say I think India is also sensitive to this sort of big picture that Toby drew, which is why there have been reports, I think now confirmed, that the MEA is planning to set up what is called a new emerging and strategic technologies division. And sort of just again, to draw this back to where we are right now at a moment in time, what is happening between the United States and China in terms of technology has happened in the past. It happened at the end of the Second World War. It happened at the end of the Cold War. And both cases, from India's vantage point, we were a spectator. In 1945, we hadn't secured our independence, but when we did, eventually the access to technologies that we wanted for the modernization of our country had dried up, because the end of the Second World War also coincided with the rise of what we call export control regimes. At the end of the Cold War, again, you know, thanks to the liberalization that happened in 1991, we secured access to a lot of consumer appliances, but things like cryogenic engines for our space program, or supercomputers that we wanted to enhance our ballistic missile program, these were kept out of India's access on account of export control regimes that came up for whatever reasons. You know, the United States and the Soviet Union then Russia may have had, and their respective allies, may have had good reasons to create these regimes. But the fact is that India now finds itself in a similar situation where the United States and China are going toe-to-toe on what are essentially, they are competing with themselves in different markets, their respective spheres of influence for technologies that they have invested in for decades. Huawei has not sort of come up overnight as a purveyor of 5G. It has spent resources and time in developing this technology. And you would forgive the Indian politician or the Indian policymaker to say, look, this is deja vu for us. We have been caught. We are the proverbial ant among elephants, and therefore it may not be sensible for us to take a decision that limits or ties our hands in the future, whether it's including somebody or excluding somebody. I think those historical parallels perhaps need a reminder, need reinvocation rather at this point.
On that note, I'm sorry, in the virtual world this conversation could go on, but in the real world we have time limits. So thank you for this conversation, gentlemen, and thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.